And this morning we consider the continued use of Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons strategy, his use of those chemical weapons on his own people. 2 years ago, the world was stunned when Assad used sarin in the suburbs of Damascus. And in that attack, on that day, 1,500 people were killed. And in response, President Obama threatened military action, and the Assad regime agreed to a hastily brokered deal to remove and destroy what was to be all of Syria's substantial stockpile. A year later, President Obama declared success, and in February, Secretary Kerry testified that, quote, "We got all the chemical weapons out of Syria." Well, that would be news to two of our witnesses here today, because they've been on the front lines struggling to save the lives of those targeted by the regime's barrel bombs that are filled with weaponized chlorine. Dr. Tanari serves in the field hospital in Idlib province, and Mr. Farouk Habib works with the Syrian Civilian Defense, a group of volunteer first responders who dig through the rubble to treat victims. As the Assad regime loses more territory, the regime has stepped up its chemical attacks on the civilian population in opposition-controlled areas. What first appeared to be random and irregular attacks has become a steady, unending series of attacks, chemical attacks, with the aim of decimating the middle class in these civilian populations. And meanwhile, that same Syrian middle class tries to hold off ISIS on the ground as ISIS tries to overrun their position. So they face a 1-2 punch of ISIS on their border and Assad's barrel bombs with chlorine coming down on the population. Over 8 weeks this spring, Idlib saw 29 chlorine attacks. Most began just 10 days after the UN Security Council passed a resolution which threatened the use of force against anyone found to have used chlorine as a weapon. In almost all cases, the chlorine was delivered by barrel bomb from a helicopter. Assad has seen the world's complacency and decided that he can literally get away with mass murder of civilians. Anyone can be a target. The regime will even drop one bomb. It will then wait for the first responders and then drop another one. Many chlorine attacks take place at night when families have taken cover. A heavy gas, a chlorine gas, seeps down into makeshift bomb shelters. As we'll hear, this toxic gas has a horrific impact on the human body. Foaming at the mouth, gasping for breath, and dying slow, agonizing deaths as the chlorine gas turns to hydrochloric acid in the lungs of the victims, many of these victims children. Unfortunately, the administration continues its slow response. Last month, the President still spoke of needing further confirmation that it was the Assad regime that is responsible for the chemical attacks. Let's be clear. Only Assad's forces have helicopters. Only Assad's forces have those helicopters take off from Assad's bases and routinely drop barrel bombs on the civilian middle class in areas like Aleppo. Yesterday, Ambassador Power told the committee here that those responsible for these attacks must be held accountable. Yes, they must. But when? When will they be held accountable? U.S. policy has to change. Last month, Ranking Member Engel and I offered a successful amendment to the Defense Policy Bill directing the Pentagon to closely examine a no-fly zone over Syria, denying Assad ownership of the skies. Syrians would no longer be forced to choose between staying above ground, where they could be killed by the shrapnel Assad packs inside the barrel bombs, or going below ground, where they are more vulnerable to suffocating from chlorine gas. The daily decision to go to the market, or to go to the school, or to go to sleep at night would no longer be a life or death decision. Of course, the United States can't do this on its own. It would need strong support and participation from our regional partners. Many of them have been asking and offering their support. The administration should also be looking at other more immediate, non-military methods that might save lives. Radar systems for opposition-held areas could serve as early warning systems. Air raid sirens could sound the alarm. Sensors could detect chemical weapons and allow first responders to be prepared as they rush to aid victims. This can't just keep going on and on. If nothing is done, the human tragedy in Syria and the region will reach depths the world hasn't seen in generations, taking a human toll, harming our security, and sending a powerful and frightening message that chemical attacks are tolerated. I now yield to Ranking Member Engel, an early and intense critic of the Assad regime and someone who has long worked to shape Syrian policy towards a humanitarian end ever since he first called to our attention the people in Damascus walking through the streets saying peaceful, peaceful in their effort to reform, and the fact that the Assad regime opened up on the civilian population with automatic weapons and slaughtered the population in the streets. He has long been focused on finding ways to end the civil war in Syria and help the suffering of the Syrian people, and I appreciate his leadership on these issues. Mr. Engel.